Okay, I think may as well get started and people will join in. I'm Suzanne Nossel. I'm the CEO of PEN America. It's great to see all of you here today. Thank you for gathering. We have opened this up, not publicly, but to people who we have worked with as partners on campuses and to some of our supporters. We're glad to have people here kind of coming at this from different angles, people who are steeped and immersed in these challenges, and those who are looking in from the outside and eager to better understand what's going on at this pitched moment in campus life. And I hope this will be a great opportunity for dialogue among a diverse group that bring different perspectives to these issues. We're aiming to leave about half of our session, or nearly half, for question and answer. So I'll ask you can start putting questions in the chat as soon as you wish to, and we will get to them probably in the second half of the discussion, but maybe some of it along the way. And we really want to be open to addressing those issues that are uppermost on your minds. I want to introduce my two colleagues who are doing this webinar today with me. John Friedman, who many of you know, who directs our free speech and education programs here at PEN America, and Nico Perez, who is our program manager for free speech and education and does a lot of our work with youth and students. You know, for us at PEN America, it has been a pretty startling sort of 5 or 6 weeks at this point, where we are seeing trends and concerns and tensions that we've been working to address for the last 6 or 7 years on college campuses coming to a head in an unprecedented way, and sort of calling into question so many of the principles that we and others have articulated. So our goal this morning is to kind of unpack some of what's been going on and offer the expertise and the learnings and the experience that we have, the thinking that we've developed in terms of how campuses can best address these challenges. It's stuff we've thought quite a lot about. So looking forward to hearing from all of you. And I just say, you know, from the start of our work, one thing that's been apparent to us is that these issues have been under-attended to on college campuses, that we deal with so many students, faculty, and administrators who've had no training in free speech, no training in academic freedom, no training in how to create an environment conducive to civic discourse across vast differences and schisms. And we're now kind of confronting the consequences of that lacuna, and hopefully this moment can be a catalyst to reshape the university environment so that we are better equipped to bring up a rising generation that's able to confront these challenges and able to engage with one another. So next slide, just move on. Thank you, Nico. I think, you know, for us, the way we frame this is that university leaders really have 3 simultaneous duties: to uphold freedom of expression, to curb violence and intimidation, and to provide equal educational opportunities for all. And getting all those 3 things right is not easy. You know, just to run through quickly the kinds of controversies that we've seen in recent weeks, these questions over, and we'll get to hopefully all of these in the course of our presentation. And if not, please ask a question if you want to hear more. Questions of institutional statements versus neutrality, how to govern and deal with hate speech, When threats and speech cross into violence, what are the limits of protest? What about faculty, academic freedom inside and outside the classroom? What about events that give rise to security concerns or concerns about the kind of speech that's going to be conveyed? The tearing down of posters and other forms of vandalism, doxing and other professional consequences that are arising for speech, the complex role of donors, and the rights and freedoms of student groups and freedom of association. Next slide. Just a minute or two on PEN America for those who are new to us. We're a nonpartisan membership organization, primarily writers of all kinds, essayists, novelists, poets, playwrights, journalists. We're part of a global network of PEN centers. We've been around for, believe it or not, 100 years, and we have a mission to both celebrate and defend freedom of expression worldwide. Next slide. Our kind of anchor and North Star is the PEN Charter, which was promulgated in 1948. It pledges us to do our utmost to dispel all hatreds and champion the ideal of one humanity, living in peace and equality in one world. And we stand for the principle of unhampered transmission of thought within each nation and between all nations. Members pledge themselves to oppose any form of suppression of freedom of expression in the country and community to which they belong, as well as throughout the world, wherever this is possible. So that dual mission of dispelling hatreds and standing up for free expression, kind of to us, is really our point of entry into our campus work. The question of how the campus can be truly open to both all people and all ideas. Just to give a quick overview, our work on campus free speech started back in 2016 when we saw a spate of controversies at places like Yale and Middlebury and the University of Missouri arising. And we became concerned that the principle of free speech was losing its moorings among a rising generation that increasingly was seeing free speech as a smokescreen for hatred and feeling like free speech was that which protects hostile speech, speech that is oppressive and offensive, and a concern that if that viewpoint took hold, that the place of free speech as a pillar of our society would be shaken. Because if young people don't buy into the idea of free speech, then they will betray those principles as they mature and take over the professional world and our institutions. And so we sort of committed ourselves to working to counter that and to try to build a culture of free speech through a whole series of activities. And you can see these are the major reports and pieces of guidance that we've issued over the years. And then on the next page, just an overview of the types of work that we've done in this arena, in addition to research, media commentary and advocacy, a lot of direct advice to campus leaders and faculty. That's where we're a little bit different than some other groups that are more in the position of issuing report cards and criticisms. We criticize and call out when we see something that we think is problematic or disagree with, but we also do a lot of collaborative work with the universities to try to help them get better at addressing these issues. And that's part of our goal today. We've done closed door convenings on campuses all across the country, workshops, trainings, student institutes and summits. And we've also become active in opposing a spate of restrictive laws and bills that aim to curb what can be taught in the classroom and to police speech on campus. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, John Friedman.
Hi, everyone. We thought it would be useful at this point to kind of say something about how we help universities communicate and educate audiences about freedom of speech, because I think the lacuna that Suzanne mentioned is really critical, that we don't have a common way of explaining the concept of free speech that, you know, all people on all campuses come to learn. This is what I have found a useful way to simply boil it down for people. The truth is that we all have to make decisions about how we draw lines around free speech when we're talking about living in civil and democratic societies. And the challenge is that around the world, societies have evolved, developed in different ways with different solutions to this problem. But at its most abstract, we can think about a spectrum, at one end of which might be a society of total free expression. People can say, anything they want at all times. And at the other end, a society where we have total regulation. Nobody can say anything. And I think most Americans, and certainly college students, certainly bristle at the idea of total regulation. And the aspiration of freedom is one that resonates with a great number of people. But the challenge isn't actually whether we want to be necessarily at one end or the other. It's where are we in the middle? And I think what's really important for people to understand is why it is that we respond to certain kinds of speech, not with censorship, but with more speech, and why regulation is so potentially dangerous. The ways in which, as speech can be invited to be regulated, can be manipulated by authorities, by government officials, has been, around the world. And we are dealing with a moment, as well as Suzanne mentioned, where we are seeing proposed regulations on academic teaching or teaching in schools, regulations being put forward about the freedom to read in public schools and public libraries as well, all of which have been deeply alarming to us as Penn. And so I think what's critical for people to understand is that, everyone can kind of get the idea that they don't want to live at, one end of this or the other, but there's going to be trade-offs. And one of the most significant challenges we face isn't that people want more free expression. It's this question of where do we draw the lines and who does the line drawing. Now, if we go to the next slide, you'll see actually this is a very useful way to think and talk about and reflect on what is the First Amendment and how does it stand out in the world. The reality is that the First Amendment is something that evolves over time. It is something that is being continually reinterpreted. The First Amendment 20 years ago might be different from how it is interpreted 20 years from now. But there is a set of ideas at the core of how this has been interpreted by the Supreme Court and by all of us who try to think about how does the First Amendment apply to new situations which we haven't seen before, whether we're talking about social media or cell phones in schools or other issues that have risen more recently. At its core, we're talking about a distinction between public and private institutions, and the idea cardinal to the First Amendment that we cannot make rules that are going to allow for what some Supreme Court justices have called the, quote, official suppression of ideas, the effort to engage in content discrimination, to suppress a particular viewpoint. And so what animates a lot of discussions about this sort of line drawing exercise is, well, how do we make sure those lines are drawn in a way that is consistent across different kinds of speech, that is supportive of the greatest amount of speech, that is not that is neutral to the viewpoints themselves. And so on most campuses, there are a set of regulations, policies, et cetera, which are broadly known as time, place, and manner restrictions that essentially try to apply this notion of viewpoint neutrality and limited regulation to all manners of spaces on campus. And I think what is very clear to anyone who starts reflecting on universities is these are enormous things. These are universities as big, a big university is bigger than many cities, right? It's not one place, it's many places. It's a classroom is not the same as the quad. So we're not talking in a lot of these conversations about one thing, and there are contextual considerations that are always going to come up. But the key is to understand that there are some amount of restrictions that are allowable. Again, considering the time, place, and manner of speech, but that those ought to be upheld and enforced and written in a way that is neutral to the viewpoints, to the expression of viewpoints, which is so critical to what academia does. Now, what's also important to know, particularly in this moment and for college campuses, is that even among all of the jurisprudence around the First Amendment, there is a particular protection for political speech, kind of as a special category. And we have seen time and again, justices say it's really important that we keep the kind of most amount of leeway around political speech for people to, essentially engage in democracy, to be reflective and critical of their governments, critical of rules, et cetera, in their lives. Now, how this line drawing exercise has been applied is not so much about the censoring or the suppression of any speech. In most cases where there are exceptions made to First Amendment protection, it's kind of best understood as where speech can turn into forms of action, where speech coupled with a kind of context in which it is aired sort of amounts to something more than just saying a view. Now, obviously, this is blurry. It's going to depend on, the particular circumstances of a legal case, et cetera. But there are these common exceptions that have been articulated in different cases that are applied to, campuses and that inform how university leaders might respond to different situations. Considerations of true threats, for example, or incitement to imminent lawless action or imminent violence, harassment, which must be severe, pervasive. It's not the same thing as one person kind of saying something to somebody else that makes them feel unhappy. It has to be repeated. It has to, in many cases, be disruptive to the person's ability to function. And so it's important when talking about free speech that we help people understand that the vast majority of things that people say are free speech, that the reason, but also that that's not just something we all need to kind of accept and live with. We need to understand how that actually protects our own ability to engage in speech and political speech as well. Next slide, please. As well, we know that while campuses have these protections around the First Amendment and freedom of speech, it is also true, and this is related to Suzanne's point earlier about dispelling hatreds that's central to Penn and its history, that campuses also have responsibilities related to the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which says that all institutions that receive federal funding can't be engaged in any kind of discrimination on the basis of race, nationality, or religion. We also have the 14th Amendment, which has certain protections against discrimination and guarantees equal access to education. And of course, there are areas where these protections for what we might call protection from a hostile environment or protection from discrimination rubs up against protections for freedom of speech. This is where most universities have general counsels, but even beyond that, it is critical that people in leadership positions attain some ability to kind of hold these ideas and these values in their heads at the same time. Also, it's vital that in the policies or practices of a university, in trainings, et cetera, we can't be upholding or trying to educate people selectively about different kinds of bigotry or hate, and that our responses to contested speech really have to be consistent and not depend upon, which protected characteristic is targeted. So if it's a religion or a nationality, et cetera, we should see consistency in how universities take these things seriously and respond to them. Next slide. So our approach that we have developed over many years, and I'm actually here in Michigan today at the University of Michigan, where I've been doing some work with the university and giving a talk about these issues, has been to really help universities deal with these situations better. I don't think it's going to be effective at all for these solutions to be imposed from the outside. And ultimately, most universities actually have a number of people in their law schools or in positions of leadership who are well-steeped, thoughtful people who want to work on these issues. They just haven't quite on many campuses worked themselves into a place of being prioritized and affected in a way where they can have a stronger impact. And so the first point that we stress a lot is that the First Amendment is not the only answer. It's only part of the answer. We kind of extend that to think both about how in response to any situation with free speech, you can't just kind of lift your hands up and say, well, it's the First Amendment, there's nothing I can do about that. I think that it's really critical that universities understand that in the moment when speech is impacting or affecting a group of people, whether it is legal or not, is actually not necessarily the first thing that people are thinking about. They're looking for empathy, they're looking for support, sometimes they're looking for de-escalation. None of that is going to be guided by a general counsel, and a lot of time that's going to be guided by a training in how to help with dialogue on the fly. I think also it's important that we recognize that private universities have very strong commitments to free speech, mostly out of their own commitments to academic freedom, and that therefore they also have a duty and responsibility, even though they are not legally held to the First Amendment in most cases, to act in ways that are consistent with being supportive of free speech. The second point that we emphasize a lot is that the drive for greater diversity and inclusion can't compromise free speech and academic freedom protections. And that, again, there is a need for universities to hold both of these ideas together. The ways that we have thought about that in a kind of practical sense are through little maxims and trainings that we give on campuses about how, in the vast majority of cases, universities have a responsibility to side with speech. But that doesn't mean they're helpless. We talk about the importance of encouraging conscientiousness with language, or using speech to condemn or respond to hate rather than censorship. Finally, I want to emphasize that this notion of democratic citizenry, or what it is that we think happens on campuses, doesn't just happen. You can't just throw a whole bunch of people, international students from different parts of the country, together on campuses, put them in residence halls, and expect that they're all going to. Of course, we wouldn't expect that they're all going to get along, but we also can't expect that they're going to have tools or ability or a common frame of reference for how they should get along with one another. And so we've talked a lot about the fact that this takes work, that universities need to do a better job of recognizing that good friction, disagreement, is actually a regular part of academia, even if it contradicts the notions of, coming together to celebrate a football game or a graduation or something like that. And that if we're going to do this, education is going to be critical. I can't say how often I encounter people on campuses who can't tell you where they learned about free speech, aren't having conversations about free speech. And so you have a situation where students, faculty, administrators of all different kinds, parents, alumni, donors, all kind of collaborate on this thing called the university, all have some kind of idea in their head about free speech and academic freedom, but nobody's actually being given a space to talk about it or to understand or come to a common understanding of what that means.
So now we're going to take a look at 3 scenarios that folks might be experiencing given the current moment. And we're going to show you what some people might be thinking, and then provide some advice, some things that Penn would consider in approaching those scenarios. So in most campus speech scenarios, campus leaders face dual impulses or multiple impulses to avoid chilling speech or censorship, while also supporting and protecting people who are impacted by speech. And so we'll start with this first scenario on institutional statements. So in the context of the Israel-Hamas war, do universities have an obligation to release public statements? Some of the things that you might be thinking: universities need not take stances on social issues of the day, espousing official political views can undermine the role of faculty, academic freedom, the risks of taking a position. As pillars of civil society, universities have a moral obligation to be speaking out about injustices, especially in cases that affect their own students. John, what do we do? How do we make sense of this?
Here's how we've thought about this, and I think it's important to understand that this is something that people can disagree about. And I think for Penn, our view is that there is it is acceptable for universities to adopt a policy of neutrality. We have seen universities like Princeton talk about not neutrality, but institutional restraint as a concept. But I think it's really important that neutrality not be kind of turned to in a moment of particular political pressure without ever having discussed it or developed a policy around that before. It needs to be something that's not, I think we've seen this where a lot of universities, it feels like the president decided on the fly that, starting on Tuesday, we're going to be neutral now. And, who was part of that decision? What policy existed to frame it? Are we going to be neutral next month? Were we neutral last month, right? Obviously, neutrality and the decision to adopt it brings all sorts of questions. I think it's also important to recognize that neutrality as a concept, we can kind of grasp at it in the abstract, but actually there are all sorts of ambiguous dimensions of what this means. So are we going to be neutral about, things that universities have strong values around? Probably not. We wouldn't expect a university to be neutral around academic freedom. Would we expect a university to be neutral around notions of inclusion or human betterment or equity? Would we expect a university, if we say a university is going to be neutral on the political issues of the day, who's going to decide where that line is and what falls, what goes through it? And so, it's important that if you are going to approach the notion of neutrality, that can't just be a kind of off-the-fly decision. It needs an elaborate sense of what that is going to mean. I think also, just in our view, it's more important that universities be allowed to make these decisions, that openness and freedom is going to be preferable to efforts to suppress how universities speak, whether we're talking about universities or their individual departments. And right now, there are also a number of proposals that we have seen in legislatures at the state level to mandate neutrality. And a law, for example, in Ohio, SB 83, has a list of things that has been proposed that universities would have to be neutral on, including marriage, abortion, other climate change, I believe, is in there as well. And so these are things on which universities do, real research, where people who work in universities may have different views about them, but the importance here is that we not, turn to legislation and allow it as the answer to some of these challenges. I think there is also a set of heightened considerations if you're going to be speaking out, thinking about how words will be heard by different constituencies if you're releasing a statement, and recognizing that as university leaders, there is a kind of duty of care if you have a powerful platform.
So let's look at a second scenario on hateful speech and disruptive protest. So there's a group of students shouting from the river to the sea indoors on a college campus. The noise disrupts a class in session nearby. How should the university respond? So some things that might be going through, your minds as this situation is occurring. Free speech must be protected at all costs. One person's hate speech is another person's cry for freedom. While also at the same time thinking, hate has no place on our campus. We all have a right to learn in safe environments. Suzanne, how do we make sense of this?
Yeah, sure. Look, it is, and this, this is definitely a rip from the headline scenario that we've seen play itself out on campus after campus in the last few weeks. Campuses have the right to impose viewpoint neutral time, place, and manner restrictions on protests. So if there's a rule that there's no protesting inside of a building or in a classroom building when courses are in session, that's perfectly legitimate. And it's important that that rule be enforced because, if it's, I think many campuses have that rule, but it hasn't come up lately. And so all of a sudden it does. And, I've seen videos of kind of flummoxed facilities officials, being confronted with what to do about a boisterous protest that people say is disrupting their ability to get work done, and the facilities person sort of throws up their hands, doesn't know what to do. And so kind of a reminder of what these policies are, a consistent approach to enforcing them, looking ahead about where you can anticipate that these policies may be violated. And time, place, and manner restrictions are a very well-established kind of part of First Amendment jurisprudence, as long as they are implemented in a way that is viewpoint neutral. So it doesn't matter what the protest is about. It could be, for or against, Israel or Palestine, but it needs to be handled in the same way. Protests can be boisterous, but they shouldn't kind of cross into shouting down the speech of others. So if there's a campus speaker who comes, let's say an ambassador or an activist, and there are there are protesters objecting to that speech, that's fine. That's great. They have the right to be there. And we talk in our materials, and I do in my book, Dare to Speak, about ways that people can protest potently with banners and by turning their backs or walking out. So many things that they can do that are powerful, that are potent, that can even garner media attention, that don't cross over into shouting down the speaker. And so that's the kind of protest that we advocate for, and that comports with the First Amendment and free speech protections. Now, on hateful speech, it is subjective, and John touched on some of this and why it is that under the First Amendment we don't make a firm distinction between free speech and hateful speech. Most hateful speech, unless it's true threats or incitement to imminent violence or harassment, here in the United States under the First Amendment, it is protected, and people are free to say it. But that doesn't mean that's the end of the line, though. Just because a university cannot ban or shut down speech doesn't mean that they have to condone it. And I think an important principle to remember is that in terms of this question of river to the sea and how speech should be interpreted, it absolutely can mean different things to different people. But I think we've sort of accepted a principle in our approach to equity in this country that those who are targeted and victimized should have a say in determining how speech about them or relating to them should be viewed, and that it's not enough that somebody just intends something in a benign or incident or innocent way. If it lands as hateful speech, that needs to be taken into account. And let's flip to the next page. I want to touch on what the university can do. Like, so let's say it's a public university where they're bound to the strictures of the First Amendment. They can't shut down hateful speech that doesn't rise to the level of harassment, a true threat, or incitement to imminent violence. That doesn't mean they just have to throw up their hands and say, First Amendment, we can't do anything. There's a lot they can do. They can speak out on behalf of the values of the university. They can educate kids so that they understand the import and the ramifications of their speech and how it lands, and not sort of cloak themselves with the excuse that they meant something different or they meant nothing by it. They can defend the speech for a legitimate debate and political speech. They can reinforce norms of civic discourse and how it is that these issues can be grappled with on campus in a way that does not cross over into hateful speech. It's important to ensure physical safety and security, to make students who are feeling vulnerable and victimized aware that there are extra measures being taken to ensure that that feeling of psychological unsafety doesn't cross over into a feeling of physical unsafety. I think it's really important to support and demonstrate solidarity with targeted students. We saw, for example, at Cornell, when there were actual threats on the Jewish Center, the president of the university going and having a meal at that Jewish center the next day with students. And I think that demonstrates an important gesture of standing with those who are victimized. And then finally, when hate speech does cross into action or harassment or threats, to investigate and hold accountable, to make clear that there are lines that are being defended. And just because hateful speech is rearing its head on campus doesn't mean it's just a slippery slope to hate crimes and a real atmosphere of violence.
And our third scenario, this one's going to be for you, John: faculty, academic freedom, and donor roles. So a Jewish faculty member posts on Facebook that, quote, "Zionism is racism." A donor asks the university to discipline that faculty member. How should the university respond? Some things and considerations. University should not police faculty speech, especially that voiced outside of the classroom. And universities have an obligation to call out harmful speech if they won't punish or remove it. How should this be approached?
I think that the concept of academic freedom in particular is one where you will find that there's no council of university presidents and faculty that gets together and determines 100% how everyone agrees about this. So what has developed originally is the notion that there are four kinds of speech that are protected for faculty: research, teaching, public engagement, and internal criticism, meaning the right of faculty to be critical of their own universities. What is clear when people talk about academic freedom, I have found it useful to imagine a kind of bullseye, that at the center are academics with expertise and academic contexts. So I'm a microbiologist, I'm teaching microbiology, or I'm producing a journal article on something I research. We all can get that that's this place and zone where academic freedom is kind of most universally understood. It's as we step outside of that where a lot of controversy and challenges arises. So for example, where you are engaging in a non-academic context, an op-ed in a newspaper, a tweet on social media, a Facebook post, standing at a political rally. Is this still your academic freedom? It also becomes a little less clear when it is not your square form of expertise. Let's say you're a microbiologist, but you're writing about a political election in another country. Is that still your academic freedom? Now, what is the case for the maximalist interpretation of this is that scholars have an incredibly unique and important role to play. That actually many people, for example, might have started with a degree in one area, but they are intellectuals. They read widely. Their disciplinary focus expands and changes, it evolves. Maybe they do acquire a new specialization in an area that's not squarely their academic freedom. And that in the interest of protecting that freedom to criticize, that freedom to think most broadly, that academics have essentially the most amount of freedom whatsoever. And so our answer to these situations has really tried to reflect that kind of maximalist interpretation as much as possible, and therefore developed a set of advice for protecting it. And that advice is that essentially universities really ought to avoid punishing faculty for their speech, whether it's in the academic classroom or whether it is in their extramural engagements, unless, and this is critical, it casts what we've called a doubt on the ability of faculty to provide an equal learning environment for all. So for example, a case that comes to mind involves a professor who wrote a blog questioning, the intellectual ability of a certain, I think it was of gay students to become public school teachers. In that case, the university felt that they shouldn't censor that professor for having written that blog, but install some protections for the students, including double-blind grading, or allowing students to move into a slightly different session by different professors, etc. And so we think that the universities can be creative in responding to these situations without engaging in censorship. On the donors question, our general view is that, of course, donors have leeway to make decisions about how they give funds to universities. I think there are certain realities about the retraction of public funding of institutions that has made philanthropy possible. I don't think that's all going to be wished away overnight, but as part of that reality, I think it is important that donors try not to interfere in the academic freedom of a university, but also are well kind of engaged with the notion of the university and what does it mean to give money to it. I think it relates to the same values of education I was speaking about earlier, which is that if you have a situation where all these people are part of universities, but they don't have a common understanding of what a university is, what academic freedom is, etc., then we're going to have a problem. Finally, I think in all of these cases, and you'll see this consistently across these issues, is that we talk about the need and the possibility for universities to acknowledge impact of speech, to condemn speech that they feel is outside of their values, but to pair that with robust and strong and consistent defenses of academic freedom. I hate what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. All of this advice is contained in our Campus Free Speech Guide, where it has sections for students, for faculty and administrators. It's a project of ours that was started, I think 4 years ago now, and we are working on expanding it with some new content in the next year. And it's clear that there is a need for this as a kind of ready go-to resource that's free and accessible on the web.
And so at PEN America, we, in responding to this urgent need to reach the rising generation, we've created several different programs that we've run all over the country through our Next Gen PEN America campaign, where we've been able to employ, pedagogies, human rights pedagogy and conversations about, how students can be using freedom of expression to activate their own movements for change and accelerate and catalyze them. We work with a diverse cohort of students from coast to coast, LA, DC, New York, Miami, Tulsa, all of our chapter cities, many different places outside. And we just really work on emphasizing PEN America's, expertise coming from human rights advocacy in the arts to generate interest and cultural support for freedom of expression.
Great. Thank you so much, Nico. And then we're going to open up to questions in a minute. I just want to touch on sort of one point, which is that all of this kind of comes amid a larger climate of rising censoriousness on college campuses and an increasing, what we see as a increasingly ready resort to legislation as the solution for what people disagree with or don't like that's happening on campus. We've done a whole series of reports on what we call educational gag orders, restrictions on what can be taught and studied in the college classroom. We've looked at laws that ban BDS and that require people who are even going to get a teaching contract in some states to disavow support for BDS, which is restrictive of their free expression rights. Just in the last week or two, there was a move in Florida to ban Students for Justice in Palestine. They said it was on the basis of material support for terrorism, but the underlying piece of evidence that they cited was a profoundly offensive flyer, but it was just a flyer. It was a piece of literature, and the definition of material support, according to Florida law, does not include written material. It includes things like financial support. So that is concerning to us. And with that, I think we're going to, just move to questions, and then I'll say a few words at the end in closing. But if people have questions, I hope you will put them in the chat, or maybe I'll say my little word now while we're waiting to see what questions may arise. But we do want to touch on what it is that is on your mind most. For us, I would say what's been instructive in this period is, and really been brought home to us, is the idea that it's not enough in order to create a diverse campus. It is not enough to simply assemble a student body that includes people from all over the country and all sorts of backgrounds and all over the world and different races, religions, ethnicities, and nationalities, and just sort of assume that that interchange is going to kind of come together, and that people are going to develop the skills to talk with and argue with one another, to hear out different perspectives and viewpoints, and that takes a lot of work. It takes work in terms of engagement with the students, training and skill building, setting up the table in classrooms so that professors are creating an environment where there is real interchange. We've heard from professors who say that people, these days won't even put up their hand to state an opinion unless they are assigned a role to play in a classroom discussion, short of being assigned, let's say to play Antonin Scalia or Ruth Bader Ginsburg, they're afraid to raise their hand. And so that's an environment where we need to be doing a lot of work to cultivate the habits that actually will make our universities more effective incubators for democratic discourse. I see we're getting some questions, so I'll start with Tom Healy. Could you please speak a bit more about different free expression obligations at public versus private institutions? John, do you want to quickly take that one?
Yeah, so legally, I think there is a distinction between public and private institutions. Public institutions have a stronger obligation to the First Amendment. There are some circumstances in which private universities, if they are taking federal funds, might be subject to the First Amendment. But if you look at the policies of universities in general, they tend to have very robust protections for academic freedom. They tend to talk in their policy documents and student handbooks about free expression, and there's a good reason for this. University is a very unique incubating, has a unique kind of democratic incubator function. It's both in terms of the ways in which we help young people learn to live and, respect difference in a pluralistic society, but it is also concerning the kind of academic dimensions to what it is a university does, the production of knowledge, the search for new ideas, the kind of give and take of questioning truths, etc. And so for this reason, we, along with many free speech organizations, have stuck to one, the idea that universities, if they have free expression policies and they are private universities, still ought to uphold them, and therefore the best way to uphold them actually isn't different between our advice for public institutions and private institutions. And then second, that even when they do not have these policies, they ought to. And so, I think a lot of questions we get a fair amount of the time are about, if this person said, something, what does it mean? Should it be protected, et cetera? And people say, well, was it a student? Was it a professor? Was it an administrator? Was it a public university, private university? But at the end of the day, in a kind of most robust idea of a free expression for a society with free expression for all, ultimately, we're talking about a situation where we should be protecting the most speech from the most people consistently.
We have a question here. What is Penn's views on compelled speech as it relates to forcing candidates at universities to write and sign DEI statements?
I can speak about that. Yeah, we don't favor compelled speech. There are these requirements that some universities have put in place or contemplated, where every person coming up for consideration for a faculty position has to sort of do a recitation of their views on DEI issues. And it feels coercive to people. I think the sense is, if you don't tick the right boxes and say the right thing, you're going to be excluded. And so we don't favor that. We also don't favor, we've seen sort of in retaliation against that, proposals for legislation that would ban any consideration of DEI issues in hiring. And we don't think that's the right approach either. It goes to our general sort of skittishness about legislated kind of top-down approaches that govern speech on campus.
Another question here asking, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just seeing the one about double standards. I think this is a real issue that has come to the foreground, and that I've certainly heard a lot about over the last few weeks, where people feel that the way that speech about, let's say racial issues is treated is not the same response that is given to speech that's about discrimination on the base of religion or nationality. And, why is that disparity there? Let's face it, there are political dynamics at work. The campuses are very left-leaning. We've had a lot of discussion in this country about the lingering legacy, stubborn legacy of racism and what needs to be done to eradicate it. We've all become much more sensitized, I think, to those issues over the last few years. And now suddenly, we're dealing with surges of bigotry pointed in different directions. And I think there is a kind of sensitization and awakening that is necessary. And, we're kind of seeing it happen as campuses come under pressure. And I think some of the pressure, frankly, is necessary to say that these forms of bigotry need to be taken just as seriously. And I think I do see in campus leadership that, for example, there are DEI offices where anti-Semitism was outside the mandate of the office. It was not something that was within their jurisdiction. And I think it is important to rectify those gaps and really ensure that obligation to provide an equal education, that is taken seriously, and that there's sort of the policies and the staffing in place to make that a reality.
I just want to add something on that, which is, I think, I have heard from many different people over many years in many different issues, this kind of idea that this, the way in which that speech was protected or the way in which the university responded to the thing last week is different from this week. And I think it's actually really vital that universities find some way to audit this, to come up with a kind of processes for figuring out how you can be consistent and how you're working with like a group of senior leaders to ensure that there is kind of consistency, continuity, et cetera. Because obviously, if there's a situation where these rules around free speech are being bent in a political manner to favor some issues or others, or disfavor others, it's quite problematic to the very principles themselves that we're talking about.
We also have a point from David in the comments on public statements. Important to differentiate between external statements and statements that the president's making to campuses, to the campus, which is also very important. Another question, can you give some concrete examples in the current context of when it would be appropriate to discipline professors?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Haas, what you're getting at is, in some cases, the Stanford case, it was not just speech, it was action. It was actually, asking people to get up and move to a corner of the classroom, on the basis of race or religion. And, that, I think pretty clearly crosses the line into discriminatory treatment. You're literally making a discernment in, how you're treating different members of the class, what they're being asked to do on the basis of religion. So that forms a pretty, I think, straightforward case. There are harder cases where it's sort of something that's said in the classroom. I've heard a lot of examples of this nature over the last few weeks where, I had one person tell me a story of a student who had told their teaching fellow they were going to be taking time off to attend, a Hillel gathering in the wake of the Hamas attacks and the war in Gaza. And then a few days later, the teaching fellow said she was canceling class so that everybody could go to the Palestine march on campus. And suddenly the student felt, gosh, I've revealed my identity and sort of maybe where my sympathies lie. And now this teaching fellow has a different perspective. What am I to do? Am I going to get a fair shake? And so, and that's tough. I mean, it's not to say that a teaching fellow doesn't have the right to bring their class if they think it's educational, if it's related to the curriculum. But when it becomes so politicized, I think it's problematic. And that we need to make sure that our educators are kind of cognizant of what it is that they're doing, what it is that they're asking of students, how it's going to be received, and what it takes to create a learning environment that really is open to all people. On just your question about Chaplinsky, that's basically sort of been overruled by more recent precedents that kind of narrow it to incitement to imminent violence or what are called true threats. So there's not really, I don't think, a living kind of doctrine of fighting words that's well defined that goes beyond that.
One thing that I often, when asked about these questions about faculty in particular around like what was said in the classroom or what was said elsewhere, on many campuses, students have been increasingly invited or encouraged to bring their concerns about a particular faculty member, not to that faculty member. This has created situations which are happening on campuses all the time, where department chairs or deans are kind of like, honestly overwhelmed in some cases with the number of complaints that they're receiving, and they haven't necessarily developed clear and consistent rules about how they should react to them. And so department chairs might react to the same set of facts differently. Faculty experience a lot of messages that are not communicated through clear kind of disciplinary proceedings, but like, okay, we've asked you to not teach for a few weeks while we just figure out what to do. And what does that mean? And if you're the faculty member, you're always saying, well, what is this process I'm participating in? How long is it going to last? Who's making determinations, et cetera? And so this is another area where universities really need to think a lot more deeply about, like, what is the standard for a quote unquote complaint? What's the standard for an investigation? That is, at the same time, there has to be some mechanism for this. So sometimes people say, well, there should be no way to investigate a professor, there should be no way to complain about them. And that's not really practical either in terms of the responsibilities that universities have, to students as well as to academic freedom. And so there is a need for more creative thinking, but more careful thinking about this issue.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we often say is that with social media and sort of the news cycle, there is this sense that universities have to react instantaneously when they get a complaint.
Yeah.
And very often kind of the better approach is to try to take a beat and express concern. Don't ignore it, don't dismiss it, but make sure you really have the facts before action is taken. I mean, going back to that question of equal treatment, I think that's extremely important. You have to look at precedents in terms of how similar speech has been treated in the past and make sure you're being consistent. I see a couple questions on doxing, which is something we've spoken out on. Maybe someone can put our statement in the chat. Doxing, we think, is inappropriate. Certainly the university should have and must have no role in exposing students' private information. We think this kind of pattern of stigmatization of students on the basis of speech, it just ups the ante and creates a more conflictual environment. Universities are supposed to be a learning environment where, we know students are going to make mistakes. They're not going to know everything. They're going to, make some rash decisions. And we've seen a lot of that just even over the last few weeks, where student groups have signed on to a statement and then they realized, well, we never consulted our whole executive board and we didn't know what we were signing up for, and retracted their signatures in some cases. And I think we need to create space for learning, for forgiveness, for repairing relationships and getting past, and that doxing can have, as we know, really permanent or long-lasting consequences. And so, I would say we do not favor that and believe it's counterproductive. I'm seeing this question. Potential donors are concerned that certain groups of faculty or departments have signed on to a particular cause. Donors are asking us whether that endorsement indicates institutional statements or positions. Is there some latitude here in differentiating the institution's voice from that of its constituent groups? I think this goes back to what John was saying at the beginning, talking about sort of these questions of institutional neutrality. And it's sort of one of the reasons why we don't endorse institutional neutrality. We don't say that it's an inappropriate posture to take, but we think it can be difficult to implement. And there may be times where the university sort of has a good reason to want to speak out in its own voice, where there is a particular group of faculty that gets momentum around a certain position, but they don't really speak for the university as a whole. Who is empowered to speak up with a different voice? And sometimes that responsibility is going to fall to the university. And so that I think the university, there could be good reason to want to retain its leeway to be a voice in its own right in those situations. Good question for you, Nico, about Next Gen Penn America and the advocacy institutes. Does college students' participation result in or allow for the formation of student-led Penn groups on private or public college campuses?
So they could. One of the things about our programs are, we hold institutes, which are longer term, educational programs We have, summits where we go to campuses to provide, workshop series for a day, or we also do standalone workshops with different clubs. Occasionally faculty invite us to speak to classes. And what we've seen is, by talking about the various areas of PEN America's work, fighting for free expression, by combating disinformation, fighting for media literacy, dealing with all of the work, writing for justice in prisons, helping writers, artists, activists, journalists around the world, achieve justice and continue to be able to do their work in exile. We're able to broaden the free speech, the political polarized American dialogue into thinking about so much more. And that has really excited students in so many different ways. And so some students have gone on from our institutes to form their own clubs, their own advocacy groups. We had the Teens for Press Freedom, a high school group that had emerged, advocating for local press freedom in New York City, as well as student press rights. We have another group that has emerged in California, the Golden State Readers, who have committed to being Californians that can fight against book bans and support students in other states. We had even a student as far out as in Paraguay, be inspired by our programs and run programs of their own. And so we've seen, so many college students, high school students really taking these programs, getting certified, and then doing the next step, coming to be a fellow with us, start their own initiatives. And it's been really, really exciting to follow. And if you're interested, you can email us at institute@penn.org, or me at nperez@penn.org if you're interested in setting up workshops for students as well.
Yeah, I
There was
see.
a question.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, just on the question of Dartmouth and other universities, I think we're always looking for places that are doing this well, and we've been thinking about other resources that can help universities to learn from one another. I think the need for collective learning, collective reflection on this particular issue is really vital. That's been a key piece of some of the advice in our Campus Free Speech Guide and in our workshops, where we try to draw on, examples of, productive, and impactful responses to hate on campus and et cetera. And thank you for the suggestion.
I got an interesting question through direct message I wanted to ask. Are any campuses getting this right?
I think that there are campuses that have been certainly trying and that haven't quite flared up in the news. So that's one of the projects that we're talking about, looking into that very question, because I think it could be very powerful to be able to find those stories and tell those stories. Right now, honestly, there's been so much news and so much demand for help. It's been a little bit difficult to hear the stories of the places where people feel like this is doing well. I think also very much a symptom of the problem that we see is that this issue is the one that exploded and has become, really controversial and challenging on campuses, but it could have been any number of any other issues. There are a number of these that are highly volatile on campuses, and we have to actually also just encourage people to recognize that a degree of volatility, a degree of good friction, a degree of kind of what has been called, the disputatious society of the United States, is part and parcel of what makes universities so special, but also so challenging. And so the idea that we've been kind of floating along and expecting that would be sustained on its own clearly is insufficient. And I'll just say also, in doing a lot of work with different campuses, universities do have a lot of resources and a lot of people who are interested in doing this work. I think there are all kinds of untapped opportunities on campuses that come from some of our interventions where we help different parts of the campus speak to one another. One of the most interesting things to know is that people who work in residence life are actually often well-trained and have like 20 years of experience settling conflicts, but they aren't tapped to do anything beyond that in the university. When you speak to people in residence life, they'll tell you they've seen all kinds of fights and they've had to resolve them for many years among different kinds of students, but universities don't really see that as a resource by virtue of the way that they're structured.
I mean, I'll give just a response to the last question I see, and then we're going to wrap, which is about student groups that may want institutional support for events, but wish to use language that may be seen as inflammatory. This has come up in relation to Students for Justice in Palestine at Brandeis, where the university sort of decided to withdraw recognition from the chapter, withhold funding, that the group would not be allowed to have gatherings on campus. And they cited a kind of harassment and threats coming from the group, but there was no actual backup in terms of what there were. And so, the statement that we made, which I hope someone will put in the chat, was urging Brandeis to come forward with, what it was in terms of the group speech that crossed those lines. Were there actual sort of incidents that they could cite so that we could be reassured that this was not being done solely on the basis of viewpoint? Because I think that's what's really important, is that, there may be criteria for who is entitled to funding from the university for a student group, but it has to be enforced in a viewpoint neutral way. And those criteria should be clearly outlined. They shouldn't be made up on the fly. If the student government is the body that's entitled to charter those groups, the administration shouldn't swoop in and take over that power. I think it's also, if a group is crossing the line, again, the university is a learning environment. Is there, any space for engagement to see whether they're willing to carry out their activities in a way that would comport with the policies? And I think, the other thing that has to be borne in mind is there is freedom of association. So even if the university is not providing financial support, to sort of say that a group is not allowed to gather on campus, in a peaceful way, could infringe upon those rights. So it's with that, I think we will wrap up. We are making this available afterward if you want to share this webinar with colleagues. I think we can also share the slides. I see some people have asked for that. And what I'll just leave you with is we hope for your engagement and support for these programs. I think the urgency of this work has never been more apparent. It may really make the difference between whether the campus kind of fractures irreparably or whether we can kind of hold together this crucial role that our universities play in soldering together a democratic citizenry and teaching us all how to live in this pluralistic society alongside people who have vastly different backgrounds and viewpoints. And, as we know from what's happening in our politics, that is essential to our national future, and universities have an indispensable role in that. And I think, for us, it's been a real call to action to double down on what we know works to facilitate an environment on campus that is both open to all people and to all ideas. So thank you so much for joining us. Please be in touch and have a great weekend. Goodbye.